Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. Tragedy in Quebec as 2 children were killed and 6 others were injured after a bus crashed into a daycare north of Montreal. There's been a lot of reaction to the Trudeau government's healthcare offer to the provinces. And a new poll has the UCP leading the NDP by a few percentage points. Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson explains where the main battleground will be heading into the May election.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. 2 children are dead and a 51-year-old man was arrested after a city bus crashed into a Quebec daycare on Wednesday morning. Police say 6 other children were taken to hospital with non-life-threatening injuries following the crash north of Montreal in Laval. Authorities did not release the ages of the dead and injured children. Witnesses say several people had to subdue the driver after he got off the bus and seemed delirious. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says Canada is considering the best way to provide support to those in both Syria and Turkey following Monday's devastating earthquake, which left more than 11,000 people dead. So far, Canada has made a $10 million funding commitment as part of international aid efforts that include search and rescue teams from the United States. Emotions are running high in Turkey and Syria right now following that deadly earthquake which took place earlier this week. Samaritan's Purse is doing what it can to help bring aid to those who need it the most. Help was sent right away from Samaritan's Purse following the quake. David Bach with the organization explains just some of the devastation that occurred as well as what they're doing to help out.
Widespread devastation, definitely. There's some concerns as far as the health infrastructure. Hospitals have been destroyed. We're just seeing just a very broad broad impacts on the entire community. We deployed an emergency field hospital, so we're in the process of that. A chartered 747 will leave Atlanta tomorrow night. It's carrying over 90 metric tons, so focused on the emergency field hospital, but also bringing some of those key relief items, our shelter tarp for communities, as well as hygiene kits to support people as they're trying to get back into life, and those kind of key things for supporting people to survive this disaster.
Following the initial earthquake, there were multiple aftershocks which devastated the area even more, affecting the more than 23 million people. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau discussed the federal government's recent 10-year, close to $200 billion healthcare offer to the provinces, calling it a historic investment. Manitoba Premier Heather Stefanson, meanwhile, who chairs the Council of the Federation, says premiers are disappointed in Ottawa's offer.
$48 billion of that brand new money that we know is going to be needed in healthcare in the coming years to make sure people have access to a primary care doctor, to support our healthcare workers, to make sure we're getting timely and proper mental health care, and to ground the system in a modern way in data and information and make sure patients get the best possible care and see that right across the country.
There wasn't a lot in the way of new funding that is a part of this package that has been put together by the federal government, and so I think to say the least, I think we were a little disappointed at that. But what I will say is that moving forward, we still want to ensure. We just received that proposal today. There's a lot of details within that proposal. We've only had it for a couple of hours, and we want to ensure that we have the time to go back to our individual areas across the country.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has reacted to the Trudeau government's healthcare funding offer to the provinces. Poilievre says our healthcare system in Canada desperately needs help.
Healthcare is broken, and the federal government is broke after 8 years of Justin Trudeau. He had money for the We Charity, $54 million for the useless and broken ArriveCan app, over $100 million for the McKinsey high-priced consultants, but he doesn't have enough money for health care. And so yesterday he announced sums that are not adequate, according to the premiers, to fix the health care damage that has emerged under 8 years of Trudeau. Obviously, a future Conservative government led by myself will keep in place these additional sums and honour the commitments made yesterday. But we regret that the Prime Minister broke the federal bank and wasted so much money that he now cannot come to the table and help relieve the suffering in our emergency rooms and on our wait lines that have grown out of control under his 8 years as Prime Minister.
Federal ministers announced that the Foundation for Black Communities has been selected to administer a $200 million Black-led philanthropic endowment fund. Housing and Diversity Minister Ahmed Hussein says this money will go a long way to helping many nonprofit groups which support our Black communities.
There are many challenges that Black-led, Black-focused, and Black-serving nonprofit organizations and charities have to contend with, and they need all the available support that they can get to help them so that they help others. This is a historic day. It is a recognition of setting up something that will sustainably support Black Canadian communities from coast to coast to coast. This fund was created by and for Black and Afro-descendant communities. And after active engagement through countless meetings, roundtables, and consultation processes, I'm pleased that we've made it to this really important moment.
A lawsuit has been launched on behalf of Canadians who were fined or forced into quarantine for refusing to disclose their vaccination status through the federal government's ArriveCan app. According to the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, the lawsuit alleges that Ottawa breached the rights of Canadians. Now, to talk about this in more detail is Hatem Kher, who's a lawyer with the Charter Advocates Canada group, which is funded by the Justice Centre, and he joins us now from Hamilton, Ontario. Hatem, what rights were breached?
In specific, sections 7, 8, and 9 of the Charter, so that's people's rights to life, liberty, and security of the person. It's people's rights to privacy, and it's people's right not to be detained unreasonably. So, I mean, the detained one, I think, is kind of the obvious one. If people remember, before ArriveCan was scrapped, Canadians returning to the country who were unvaccinated or who, for any reason, refused to use the app were required to quarantine in their homes for 14 days, which is essentially much like a house arrest, if not more strict than the average house arrest would be as a result of a criminal sentence.
Now, obviously, your clients are looking for monetary compensation. How much are we talking about here?
So the statement of claim that we filed is seeking a total of not more than $50,000 across 10 applicants. So that would be an average of $5,000 per applicant. And the reason for that number is it's on the one, it's a nominal number. You know, there's no amount of money really that can make up for having someone's rights violated. But it's something that puts a number on the harm that was caused to them, both in terms of the actual disruption to their lives that they experience, but then also the kind of moral harm experienced by having one's rights violated. And it gives a number that is both, on the one hand, serious, but on the other hand, they're not doing this for the money, they're doing this for the principle.
Thanks so much, Hatem. That was Hatem Kher, lawyer with the Charter Advocates Canada group, who joined us from Hamilton, Ontario. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has had his fair share of critics, especially here in Alberta. Now, there's a Calgary-based author who wrote a book called How the PM Stole Our Freedom. Derek Smith says what makes his book unique is that it uses humor with a bit of a Dr. Seuss flair.
People don't want to hear criticism when it comes to the current prime minister or his policies. And I've always been told that comedy is the best form of therapy. So when it came to a lot of the things that we put in the book, I mean, we've got the jokes on the blackface incident, the paper drink box, water bottle sort of things, a lot of his different policies, you know, saying he's sick and hiding in his house. I really, again, when I started thinking about the Grinch book, it started to just make sense to me that there were a lot of comparisons that I could really put in line to make a funny story.
Make sure you catch the full interview with Calgary author Derek Smith and BCN producer Michael Clausen coming up in the second half of our newscast. Well, some areas of southwestern Alberta saw some light flurry activity earlier today. Jeanette Rocher is here now with an early peek at the forecast. Jeanette, the white stuff we received should be melting again soon?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'd say most of it is melted away already, Hal, when I was out there earlier today. Lots of dry pavement and feeling like springtime conditions. So I say we're doing pretty well, although we are expecting another 60% chance of flurries overnight this evening with an overnight low of -7. Now couple that with a 40 kilometer per hour wind. It's going to feel with the wind chill more like -11 when we get up tomorrow and get on our way. So we're going to want to probably bundle up. It is going to be a layers day though, because we are expecting a high of 6 degrees and plenty of sunshine, also a 60K wind. So it is also going to be a bit of a gusty one. But the good news is plenty more plus temperatures where that came from, and lots of clear skies as well for the rest of the week. I'll be back later in the newscast to give you that 7-day update.
Looking forward to it. Thanks so much, Jeanette. The Alberta government announced that it is expanding the New Beginnings bursary to help 1,700 low-income students to become nurses. Government officials say thanks to an additional $8.5 million investment into the initiative, the nursing students will be eligible for a one-time, non-repayable $5,000 bursary. Those in nursing programs will be automatically selected from student loan applicants who meet program and financial eligibility criteria. While the opposition NDP was not impressed with the UCP announcement, advanced education critic David Eggen says the funding is pennies on the dollar compared to the cuts and increased costs students have faced under the UCP.
Quite literally, we have a crisis in post-secondary of affordability. Tuition increases have happened every year since the UCP government took power. And then that's being compounded with a general affordability crisis that we are all feeling in the province, and maybe students even more. And so while the government is announcing some small measure for low-income students, quite literally, all the students are experiencing unaffordable tuition and expenses at this juncture here in the province.
If the provincial election was held today, it appears as though Daniel Smith and the UCP would be re-elected. Now, a recent poll by ThinkHQ says the UCP currently has 48% support compared to the NDP's 45%. Our legislative reporter, Tyler Dawson, says this is the first time in quite some time that the UCP has been in the lead.
The notable thing about this poll is that this, I think, is the first time that the UCP have been sort of in the lead in the polling for quite some time, like probably a year and a half. Over the course of the pandemic, their popularity really dropped. Rachel Notley's party really grew. So what this really suggests is that there's a little bit of a tailwind here for the UCP, and whether or not they can hold on to that lead over the next few months remains to be seen, of course. Whether or not Rachel Notley's party can come up with something that's going to shift those numbers around remains to be seen.
Our legislative reporter, Tyler Dawson, will also have more on Premier Smith's meeting with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Ottawa recently. That's coming up in the second half of our newscast. Lethbridge City Council conditionally approved close to $5 million in municipal funding requests for the federal Rapid Housing Initiative. City staff say the money could be used to leverage close to $39 million for the proposed projects. Now, this includes just under $2 million for the Blackfoot Family Lodge, $1.5 million for the Blood Tribe, and $1.5 million for My City Care. All municipal funding is conditional upon each project receiving RHI funding. Lethbridge Mayor Blaine Higgins says if these projects were to be approved, they would go a long way in helping our city's most vulnerable.
It would take many of the folks that we have on our street and those most vulnerable and get them into a home. So it's extremely important. Again, it's something that is a top priority for this council, and to see this, 3 organizations come forward and want to help with the funds that they're providing as well, outside of even the federal funding or provincial funding that may come, is just it's fantastic to see, to be very honest.
The 3 applicants' next steps will be to apply for that funding, and the deadline for organizations to do so is March the 15th.
Let's get this started.
The Lethbridge Polar Plunge made huge waves over the weekend. Participants braved the cold weather on Saturday to raise funds for Special Olympics Alberta. Braylon Hagan, a constable with the Lethbridge Police Service who was involved in this year's event, talks about how much has been raised so far here in our region.
The fundraising is still coming in. I think we are over about $13,000 right now, but I know even with our own personal group, we are still collecting money, and I've seen money coming in still. So we're holding open the registration until March 1st. So I'm hoping to see an increase in that. But right now we're about $13,000 for just Lethbridge alone. The province, we're getting close to our goal of $150,000. We're about $135 right now. So considering last year we only were about $80,000 or just over $80,000, this is a huge improvement compared to last year.
Those are some very brave souls in the cold water. By the way, Higgins says at the end of February, the Provincial Special Olympics will be taking place in Strathcona County. And later in June, the World Games will begin in Germany. The 13th annual Care from the Heart Radiothon is back on Thursday. The annual event is a chance for local radio stations to chat live on air with nurses, doctors, and donors to talk about the impacts the donations from the Chinook Regional Hospital Foundation have had on the community. Staff from the foundation explained how they're hoping to raise this year, how much they're hoping to raise, and what the money will be going towards.
We're hoping to raise upwards of $250,000, and the money goes to the greatest needs of the hospital, be it through the emergency, mental health, addictions, day procedures, diagnostics, whatever that might be. It certainly will go to some of the greatest needs, and some of the dollars just in the past year alone have gone to the hospital's purchased Staxi chairs, handheld vein finder, a Sonsonite ultrasound, jaundice meter. Those are just a few of the items that that we have purchased for the hospital this year. And we're very, very proud of that.
Over $3 million has been raised since the Care from the Heart Radiothon began 13 years ago. The game of street hockey has been a Canadian tradition for generations. Now, the City of Lethbridge is looking at spreading the growth of the sport here in our city. Lethbridge City Council was supposed to look at a funding request of $200,000 for the city to be able to host Play on Canada street hockey events from 2023 to 2026. Now, that translates to around $50,000 each year for the initiative. City staff, however, asked Council to move the item to an April Economic SBC meeting, as Play on Canada has not yet received federal funding.
Their plan to organize their events across Canada is in jeopardy right now, and therefore they're essentially postponing all activities for 2023. The request coming back in April will be a fulsome request as per Council's or as per Economic SPC's direction previously, which will indicate what sorts of in-kind activities the city would be prepared for our contribution, prepared to provide, in addition to the revised requests, which I suspect will remain the same at $50,000 per year for 2024, 25, and 26.
The first Play on Canada street hockey tournament was held in Halifax back in 2003. Now, since that time, a total of 170 Play on events have been held in 37 communities involving over 400,000 participants. Religious leaders and volunteers from the Kyiv Jewish Messianic Congregation hosted an appreciation day for soldiers of the Ukrainian army. Organizers said it was a way to thank the armed forces for fighting to protect their freedoms. Now, this next story, produced by KJMC Media, captures the atmosphere of this very special event.
Перша, напевно, і глобальна ціль цього заходу – це сказати дякую нашим військовим, що вони боронять нашу країну. Тут зібралися люди, до яких ми їздимо на передову, до яких ми ходимо в госпіталь, до тим, кому служили на протязі з 24 лютого. Це не просто люди, а люди, з якими довгий час спілкувалися, підтримували їх та молилися за них. І ми зробили для них цей вечір подяки 24 грудня на 7-й день Хануки.
Ми, звісно, як єврейська громада святкуємо Хануку, але ми хочемо також в цей ханукальний святковий вечір подякувати нашим захисникам за їх таку дуже-дуже непросту роботу. Ми, як волонтери, капелани, які служать цим людям, ми розуміємо насправді, яку ношу вони несуть в цей час, тому хочеться їх підтримати, подякувати і хоч трішки такого світла, радості і свята принести до їх життя.
На такому заході я вперше. Мене зараз вже там друзі, знайомі, сім'я вже називають героєм. Я їм всім кажу одне: героєм я буду після закінчення війни, після перемоги. А зараз, рано поки про це говорити. Щодо саме таких дійств, заходів, це, думаю, нормально, тому що все ж таки більшість, хто сюди приходить, вони або комісовані, або травмовані зараз на лікуванні. Ось, тому це для них ще одна змога зустрітися з собі подібними, теж там обговорити, порозмовляти про своє.
Дуже різні люди зібрались, і тут відбулося таке яскраве чудо, що один військовий зустрів свого давнього друга, який там півроку назад його спас, витащив з окопу.
Ці дуже дорогі люди, які принесли жертву на захист України і на всіх. Вони були реальним благословенням для нас. Мені здається, що ми в деякій мірі теж для них, але головне, що тут Господь був у центрі.
Looked like it was an incredible event. Well, we've had some incredible temperatures here in much of southwestern Alberta, and fortunately, more sunshine and warmer temperatures are on the way. A full look at the weather picture is coming up. Well, we saw some light flurries in parts of southwestern Alberta again today, but fortunately, a lot of the white stuff has melted once again. Jeanette Rocher is in now with all of the weather details. Jeanette, we should be remaining on the plus side of things for most of the week.
Yeah, I'm happy to report it is going to be fairly mild over the next several days. We are looking at those plus temperatures all the way through until, next week, but we'll worry about that then. For now, we are looking at plenty of sunshine. Thursday high of 6 degrees, 8 degrees expected to be the high for Friday, 6 degrees on Saturday. Same thing for Sunday. Should be a fairly lovely weekend, clear skies as well. And then a high of 9 degrees, so getting close to those double digits. And then all the way down to -1 for the expected high on Tuesday, also seeing a chance of snow. The average high for this time of year, 1 degree. Average low, -12. 17 was our high temperature on this day back in 1954. And back in 1994, we had the coldest, which was -37. Daylight. Okay, we're looking at sunrise this morning at 7:54 a.m., 1 minute earlier than yesterday, and the sunset this evening at 5:37, 1 minute later than yesterday. And so we're looking at 2 minutes longer of daylight, giving us 9 hours and 43 minutes of daylight today. Not too bad. Okay, Victoria expecting a high of 10 degrees. Tomorrow, 40% chance of showers and close to 60 winds near the Harrow Strait. 9 degrees expected to be the high in Vancouver with a 60% chance of showers. Edmonton, lots of sunshine, looking at a high of 1 degree. 4 degrees the high in Calgary with mainly sunny skies there as well. Now, wind chill factors are also an issue as well in both Calgary and Edmonton, feeling more like -12 and -9. Same thing for the cities here in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. -4 the high in Saskatoon, -7 in Regina, -7 in Winnipeg. Clear skies, but with wind chill going to feel quite a bit chillier than those expected highs as we get to the central part of the country. Heavy rains expected in Toronto tomorrow morning, 15 to 25 millimeters of rain. Also a risk of some freezing rain in the northern side of town there. 3 degrees the high in Ottawa, expecting snow or ice pellets mixed with freezing rain. 1 degree the high in Montreal. And Montreal also looking at 2 to 4 centimeters of snow mixed with some freezing rain. Okay, not so much the case over here in Atlantic Canada, looking at mainly clear skies. -1 the high in Fredericton, 1 degree the high here in Halifax. Charlottetown looking at a high of -6. Now, there is some mixed precipitation expected by Friday, particularly in Fredericton and Charlottetown. -3 the high tomorrow in St. John's, Newfoundland. Looking at a chance of snow, some windy conditions as well there. So there you have it. That is your forecast.
Today's weather report is brought to you by Ridge Utilities, providing competitive rates for electricity, natural gas, and internet, while investing back in communities across southern Alberta.
Experts say consumers are not likely to receive relief from a sharp jump in prices for gas-powered vehicles, despite cost reductions on a number of electric vehicles this year. A recent Scotiabank report said the average selling price for a new vehicle is running around $45,500. That is more than 30% higher than in 2019. Analysts say there's less competition for gas-powered vehicles as manufacturers are still chipping away at the part shortages that emerged during the pandemic. They say there will likely be an easing of the pressure rather than a rapid shift in prices as inventories build up. Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem says higher interest rates are working to cool the economy as elevated borrowing costs are constraining spending on vehicles and appliances. He says the economy will continue to slow as demand for goods and services falls. The Bank of Canada said it will take a conditional pause to assess the effects of higher interest rates on the economy. But Macklem says that the central bank will be ready to raise rates even further if inflation proves to be more stubborn than expected. It is currently hovering at around 6%. New stats show business insolvencies in Canada skyrocketed last year as the country struggled to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. The Office of the Superintendent of Bankruptcy says bankruptcies and consumer proposals were up 37.2% from 2021 to just over 3,400. Many of the filings were led by the accommodation and food service sectors, along with the construction industry. The federal regulator says consumer bankruptcies, meanwhile, dropped 10.5% from a year earlier to 24,586. Consumer insolvencies overall were up, though, 11.2%, as the number of consumer proposals rose from just over 62,000 to over 75,500. Microsoft is fusing ChatGPT-like technology into its search engine, Bing. Company officials say the aim is to transform the internet service into a new way of communicating with artificial intelligence. The revamping of Microsoft's search engine would give the software giant a head start against other tech companies. Along with adding it to Bing, Microsoft says it's also integrating the chatbot technology into its Edge browser. The company announced the new technology from its headquarters in Redmond, Washington. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was down 45 points on the day to finish at 20,679. The Dow was down 207 points to 33,949. The S&P 500 was down 46 on the day to 4117, and the Nasdaq was down 203 points to 11,910. West Texas Intermediate Oil was up $1.35 to $78.49 US per barrel. Natural gas was down 17 cents to $2.42 US. Gold was up $2.69 to $18.75.80 US an ounce, and silver was up 15 cents to $22.32 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $11.87 per bushel, barley's at $9.10, canola's at $18.73, and corn is at $11.18 per bushel. Live cattle were up 23 cents to $160.80. Feeder cattle March contract was down 75 cents to $186.45, and lean hogs were up 55 cents to $75.93. The Canadian dollar was down slightly over the past 24 hours to 74.36 US. Recapping one of our top stories, 2 children are dead and a 51-year-old man was arrested after a city bus crashed into a Quebec daycare on Wednesday morning. Police say 6 other children were taken to hospital with non-life-threatening injuries following the crash north of Montreal in Laval. Authorities did not release the ages of the dead or injured children. If a provincial election was held today, it's possible that the UCP would win a minority government. That's according to a recent poll by ThinkHQ. Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson will share the details momentarily. Listen, if you see news happening in your community, be sure to drop us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is in Ottawa for the First Minister's meeting. Now, there's a video of her when she first met Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and it looked a little bit awkward with that handshake there, but it makes for good TV. Now, the big reason for Smith and other premiers meeting the PM was to discuss health care. Now, to talk about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, it may have been a little bit awkward between the PM and Premier Smith, but you got her message across in a hurry. But you didn't, however, discuss healthcare right away, but instead talked more about the federal government's Just Transition Plan.
Yeah, so, a lot of Danielle Smith news in the past day or so from that First Minister's conference, as you mentioned. There was a handshake in which she sort of stuck her hand out and then seemed to change her mind, but Trudeau kind of lunged for it and grabbed it before she could pull it away. It was a very strange television moment. but perhaps is hinting at some of the awkwardness between her and the Prime Minister, which I think is probably safe to say exists. She did talk just transition. Of course, this goes back, a month or so now when Jonathan Wilkinson, the Natural Resources Minister, announced the details of a just transition would be coming. This is, of course, the Liberal plan to retrain and transition people from oil and gas jobs to whatever else, clean energy jobs, janitorial jobs, a variety of possibilities there. And that caused quite a bit of consternation in Alberta political circles. In fact, you had this amazing moment of bipartisan unity when Rachel Notley also said that this plan needs to be scrapped and they need to go back to the drawing board. So Smith had been quite bullish in the beginning, but then maybe last week or the week before, had a more conciliatory letter saying she wanted to talk with Trudeau about this. And they did apparently have that discussion, and there are apparently some areas of agreement. LNG and hydrogen, for example, being two of those. So she talked about that. Did talk about healthcare, and healthcare, I think, is really the thing that everyone is watching at the moment.
Yeah, let's talk about that proposal from the Trudeau government here. 10 years, $196 billion for healthcare for the provinces, and many would argue that it would help solve some of the healthcare issues we've been facing right here in our province.
That's right. And we don't know at this point how much money from that might be going to Alberta. Now, only I think about $46 billion of that is new funding. The rest of it was already sort of baked in Canada Health Transfer funding. So that's the Liberal proposal. I'm sure there's going to be back and forth. I'm sure we're going to hear, even if the deal gets signed, I'm sure we're going to hear complaints from the premiers about it in the weeks and months ahead. The sticking point for the last couple months has been the Liberal government in Ottawa wants conditions on that funding. They want some of it to go, for example, to data collection, so that there will be sort of a national database of statistics across the province or across the country, I should say. And the provincial premiers have been very reluctant to agree to any conditions. So I think we'll see some back and forth on that. And then, of course, we'll see what's done with that money, where exactly it's going to go in the healthcare system. And that, of course, remains to be seen. And, of course, some of the problems with the healthcare system, the doctor shortage, nurse shortage, for example, those are not problems that an influx of money can solve immediately. So we'll have to see what the government dreams up on that front as well.
Now, Tyler, the extra funding in healthcare is potentially good news for Danielle Smith's UCP as we lead up to the provincial election in May.
It is. A lot of polling suggests that some of the bread and butter issues are the ones that are really on Albertans' minds right now. So that's things like healthcare, that's things like education. And so if they can, they should, in theory, by the time the election rolls around in May, be able to point to this as a bit of a win. So, we negotiated this alongside the other premiers and it'll do X, Y, Z for the for the province. And they do have this sort of panel going on right now where they're studying AHS reform and things like that. So healthcare, I think, is going to be a big one. And the question, of course, for both parties and for Albertans is whether or not the United Conservatives or the NDP can be, sort of most trusted, I suppose, to pull that off.
And, when it comes to the budget, it seems like healthcare and education always takes up a big portion of that budget, too. Now, one of the big healthcare reforms that the UCP have implemented so far, Tyler, is transferring people who call 911 over to 811. So what will that mean for Albertans?
Right. So the idea is basically, you call 911 with some issue and the 911 caller says, look, we don't think this is an emergency that we're going to send an ambulance for. We'll transfer you to 811 to talk to a nurse. They will then tell you what to do next. And so that's already apparently diverted, I think, about 1,000 ambulance calls across the province. The idea being basically there's a finite number of ambulances. People are riding in ambulances who could be taking a cab or an Uber or having their friend drive them. And so if you can free up those ambulances for more severe cases, that might help the medical system. Of course, there has been some controversy about this. It was only a matter of time before someone got, transferred inappropriately, or that people felt they were transferred inappropriately, and that is in fact what has happened. There have been some complaints from people who say that they should have got an ambulance but were instead sent to 811. The province is sort of standing by this, saying that they've reviewed those calls and that nothing inappropriate happened. Copping's office, the health minister's office, says that this should free up about 40,000 ambulance rides across the province over the course of the year. So I do expect we will continue to hear some controversy about that, but it is maybe a sign that one of these proposals is having some impact.
What are you hearing from the legislature when it comes to the potential of decentralizing EMS dispatch? A lot of municipalities, including here in Lethbridge, are not happy with the fact that the province centralized everything to save about $6 million a year. What are you hearing right now?
Yeah, I haven't heard very much. This came up, I think, a couple times during the UCP leadership race. And actually, for the life of me, I can't remember what Danielle Smith's position was on it. But, I think that's probably another thing that we can look at in terms of the election. If there's going to be election promises, campaign promises in either party's platform. The New Democrats, for example, are working on their sort of healthcare proposals at the moment. So perhaps that will be in it. It's a bit of an interesting one because that's primarily small town and rural Alberta affected, which is pretty much a lock for the UCP. So do they benefit by shaking that up any further, or does the NDP try and, get some votes in rural and small town Alberta by proposing this? So I think that's something to watch for in the weeks ahead.
Now, speaking of which, Tyler, let's talk a bit about the new poll that says the UCP is now leading the NDP in Alberta. According to the folks with Think HQ, voter intentions are, 48% support for Danielle Smith's party, while 45% would support Rachel Notley's NDP. It appears as though the NDP have a healthy lead in Edmonton, the UCP, as you mentioned, in rural Alberta. So that leaves my hometown of Calgary as a real battleground.
Battleground Calgary, it's sort of this truism in Alberta politics that there's three constituencies in any election. There's Edmonton, there's Calgary, and there's, everyone else. And in order to form government, you need to win two of those. The notable thing about this poll is that this, I think, is the first time that the UCP have been sort of in the lead in the polling for quite some time, like probably a year and a half. Over the course of the pandemic, their popularity really, really dropped. Rachel Notley's party really, really grew. So what this really suggests is that there's a little bit of a tailwind here for the UCP, and whether or not they can hold on to that lead over the next few months remains to be seen, of course. Whether or not Rachel Notley's party can come up with something that's going to shift those numbers around remains to be seen. And it's a tight race in Calgary. I think you said 48 to 45 across the province. In Calgary, it's 47 UCP, 45 for the New Democrats. So that's, I think, where you're really going to see the fight, especially, I think, in some of the suburban ridings. I think downtown probably swings a little bit more New Democrat. So it'll be in some of those sort of outside areas and maybe some of the bedroom communities of Edmonton as well that are the battlegrounds. And of course, Lethbridge will likely have a seat or two that are going to be hotly contested. But, it really suggests that the tone is shifting perhaps in Alberta. And that's definitely going to be something to watch. In addition to the fact that because Calgary is likely to be the battleground, we have to wonder what this government is going to do for Calgary. Is it going to really push hard on an arena deal? Is this going to be rail travel to Banff from Calgary? Some of those things that might really energize Calgary voters.
And what's interesting about Lethbridge that you brought up too is the fact that it seems like it's really split down the middle. You've got Shannon Phillips, the Alberta NDP MLA, Lethbridge West, who has her support, and then Lethbridge East, we have Deputy Premier and Infrastructure Minister Nathan Neudorf as well, so a lot of support from both parties, so it should be quite interesting. Now, Tyler, you also, speaking of Lethbridge, you probably heard about the cancellation of Francis Widdowson's speech at the University of Lethbridge. Now, the province is demanding, since that happened and all of the protesters that came out, the province is demanding that the U of L is going to provide a free speech report card. Actually, not just the U of L, but all universities. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so back in 2019, the provincial government had all universities and colleges in the province adhere to the Chicago principles, which are, sort of free expression principles for universities, and they had to come up with, free expression statements and that sort of thing. So that exists already. What has changed in the past week or so is this report card thing, as you mentioned. Details are pretty slim on it at this point, I would say, but generally that's going to be the universities are going to have to report back on free speech issues that have come up on campus, how they've addressed them, that sort of thing. No information yet on what penalties, for example, might look like, but certainly this government sees some advantage here in tackling free speech on campus issues. So I think that's something we'll see a little bit more on, especially as we go into the election campaign.
Yeah, when I went to Mount Royal many years ago in Calgary, I mean, free speech, you want to hear from all sides, like everybody's viewpoints, and then make your decision then. So, you know, maybe this is a good thing for a lot of the post-secondaries here in our province. Tyler, former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney is back in the news. It appears as though Kenney is staying here in Alberta, and he landed a gig at a law firm in Calgary.
Yeah, Bennett Jones. So he'll join Christy Clark, who was a former premier of British Columbia, and John Baird, who he was a cabinet minister with during his time in Ottawa. And there's a couple other sort of ex-politicians who are with Bennett Jones. You know, this is a relatively common career trajectory for sort of former politicians. They go work at law firms as, in some cases, lawyers, but in other cases as sort of special advisors. That's what Jason Kenney is going to be. You know, they sort of meet with clients and use their networks of contacts to sort of help out the law firm, things like that. So that's what we know about what Kenney's doing. You know, there was some speculation that he might come back if Danielle Smith crashed and burned. There was some speculation that he might go back to Ottawa if Pierre Poilievre loses the next election. We now know that he's going to be with Bennett Jones, at least for now.
A healthcare official many Albertans got to know during the pandemic was Dr. Deena Hinshaw. Tyler, the deposed Chief Medical Officer of Health, has moved to British Columbia.
Yeah, speaking of people who got new jobs, as probably everyone knows, Deena Hinshaw was, you know, moved out of her Chief Medical Officer of Health role by Danielle Smith's government. She now has a 6-month contract as a provincial health officer, deputy provincial health officer, I think is the official title. So she'll be working under Dr. Bonnie Henry in British Columbia, who's obviously the Chief Medical Officer of Health there. So 6 months for her. She's landed on her feet with a gig in Vancouver or Victoria, it sounds like.
Hopefully she's making double the salary, Tyler, because it's pretty expensive living in British Columbia these days.
It is.
He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks so much for joining us once again from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal.
We enjoy finding out about new books which discuss the issues of life and provide solutions, or maybe a way to persevere through the challenges of life. One book that has made a big splash here in Canada is the satirical work of Derek Smith from Calgary, Alberta. One of his latest books is How the Prime Minister Stole Freedom. It is the #1 bestseller in the dark humor category on the Amazons. Derek Smith, welcome to Bridge City News.
Hi, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great for us to have you here. And of course, I've got to mention, great background. Love that.
Thank you.
It's colorful, just like your book. So can you give us the Coles Notes of what your book is all about?
Well, How the Prime Minister Stole Freedom was a passion project after watching the events that unrolled during the Freedom Convoy. As the pandemic rolled on and I seen what it did to people's mental health with lockdowns, with restrictions, after watching the live streams and seeing what it felt to be Canadian again, to see this group of people speaking out for frustrated Canadians as well as for an industry that desperately needed people to speak out for it, I knew I wanted to get into the satirical realm with books, and we kind of wanted to do something that was geared towards adult but you know, drawn towards the child aspect, and you know, I started thinking about the Grinch, and I started thinking about all these different ways that we could fit in some of the jokes when it came to Justin Trudeau, because let's be honest, his gaffes kind of write the material itself. So at the end of the day, we took a lot of those jokes and put them into the book. We touched on the Freedom Convoy, we touched on the lockdowns, and it resonated with people and just took off. And it's been an astounding career moving forward. I've met some wonderful people. And we've really, I guess, touched some people where they needed to be entertained and have the need to laugh again because people had forgotten over those 2.5 years. And I think that was the most important aspect of this book, was to give people a chuckle.
Right. So did you have the opportunity to attend the Freedom Rally in the nation's capital last year?
So I was unable to do that because, again, of restrictions and flight restrictions and whatnot, being in Alberta. I did not get on board with the convoy. I was watching a lot of the live streams that were going on and kind of getting into some of the YouTube channels. In fact, one of the YouTubers who propped our book up and got it noticed was Clyde Do Something, who started his channel around that time of the Freedom Convoy and has gained very notable traction since then, and has since become a very good friend of mine. and very informative. I would highly recommend anybody who hasn't heard of him to go check out his channel.
Talking about the colorful background that you have, and your book is very colorful, why pick the style of satire and parody for this book that you have?
Well, if there's one thing I've noticed, that whenever opposition comes to be critical of our current government, it's often met with, we'll just say, a smothering boot, so to speak. People don't want to hear criticism when it comes to the current prime minister or his policies. And I've always been told that comedy is the best form of therapy. So when it came to a lot of the things that we put in the book, I mean, we've got the jokes on the blackface incident, the paper drink box, water bottle sort of things, a lot of his different policies, you know, saying he's sick and hiding in his house. I really, again, when I started thinking about the Grinch book, it started to just make sense to me that there were a lot of comparisons that I could really put in line to make a funny story. And at that point, it just became relevant that let's see if there's a market for this. And it turns out there was, and we couldn't be happier.
Right. So do you feel a bit like a court jester?
A little bit. It's funny you mentioned that when the book launched and we were featured during its takeoff days by the National Post. And the day that article reached out, I was contacted by an agent who said he had a client who was interested in talking to me. Turns out that client was Preston Manning. And Preston Manning reached out to me as a fan. He had purchased the book, he'd read the book and enjoyed it. And that the court jester speech is actually what he included in his email to say, you know, back in the old times, the court jester was the only one immune from mocking or satirically pointing fingers at the king. So he says, you've kind of turned into Canada's court jester. And that is, you know, a title I'll happily accept at this point.
Well, and especially from Preston Manning, you're in good company
Absolutely.
with him. And it is true that, you know, we can have comedy, we can have mainstream media and independent media and those things, but that role, whether it was 500 years ago in a king's courtroom, so to speak, or now, we still need the work of that court jester. So speaking of being surrounded by people, you were around people considered last year especially to be the unacceptable fringe. What is the biggest misconception that maybe you still hear talked about regarding those who participated in the Freedom Rally in Ottawa?
Well, it's funny you ask, because during my time with this book, one of the people I've come into contact with and become very close friends with is, in fact, Tamara Leach. And she's introduced me to a plethora of people, from Keith Wilson, the Eva Chipiuk, the Freedom Convoy board themselves, several people within the workings of that. And what I find is that the news always reports one thing, and what you see in front of your eyes is another. Anytime I see any article that tries to villainize what happened or suppress what went on, I always look at it with a grain of salt and say, you know, it's unfortunate. People can't meet these individuals head on and see what kind of people they actually are. Anytime I've spoken with Tamara or see Tamara, I'll tell you right now, she is the kindest, nicest, noblest person I've probably ever met in my life. I don't know if she has a bad bone in her body just because she's so friendly and caring. I always make the joke that she's Canada's mom. She kind of looks after everybody. But it's been an absolute pleasure to be around those people. I think that the purpose they set out to accomplish in Ottawa was achieved, despite the silencing of Tamara and the unfair lockups. The constant persecution, and still ongoing persecution, I might add, when you look at the Emergency Act Commission as well as Tamara's trial still awaiting to take place. But all in all, I think that was probably the greatest success for myself coming out of this book, was having the ability to meet with those people, thank them for the insurmountable, unpayable debt that they've given every Canadian for what they did, and for what every trucker did going to Ottawa, as well as every protester who joined them on the street. I think it is an event that's going to go down in history, and one that I'm proud to be a part of.
Yes, absolutely. I know I thoroughly enjoyed my 2.5 weeks there. Best assignment I've ever had, I can assure you. One of the things you touched on, maybe without using the word, it seems to me that there's a lot of manipulation in Canada's media. Is there a piece of advice maybe you would give to our viewers or your readers about seeing through the manipulation or resisting the manipulation that we see in media?
Well, the thing I find in any kind of attachment to the media is that you have to look at it that it's a business. It's a business at the end of the day. And Kevin O'Leary on Dragon's Den and Shark Tank, as much as I don't like his personal views on some things, the one thing he's always said that makes sense is follow the money. And when you follow the money, you can see with a lot of media where they get their payments from, which when you look at corporate media, as I call it, it tends to come from the government. When you look at bills like Bill C-11, it starts to tell a tale that when you do your own research, which I think is the most vital thing anybody can do. I've heard so many times where people take one news story and they just take it as fact, no matter what source that comes from, whether it be independent, whether it be government funded media, corporate media, a YouTube channel. I think the most important thing you can do if a story interests you is get online, dig where you can, find sources, find people with common interests, get your information from multiple sources, and then make your own judgment. I've never been one to follow the pack, so to speak, when it comes to what I want to believe and what I hear coming out of things. Sometimes things can be misconstrued. If you ever look at a high school and you look at the way children or teenagers used to talk with each other, where they say one person tells another and then another, by the time it gets to the 100th person, that story is often twisted and misrepresented. So I think it's always best that before you pass judgment on anything, you take your time to do your research and make sure of what your views and opinions are 100%.
Exactly. And speaking of research, as I was researching for this interview, I noticed the odds were forever in your favor with the Amazon reviews. You had like 90% giving your book 5 stars, and the 1 stars only 6%, very few and far between. So can you give us maybe some of the feedback you've received, or maybe your opinion on why the responses were so heavily rated to the 5 stars?
Well, I think, again, the book resonated with people that were just fed up. I think there was an undeniable crowd of people that were looking for something they could get on board with and feel connected to. And I'm very grateful that our little project turned into something that those people felt they could attach themselves to. I've been told by countless individuals that, again, even though the book wasn't written for children, I hear people saying, hey, we read this book to our kids all the time. They enjoy it. They love it. And I mean, that hits home for me because my daughter often requests my book. I certainly do not impose that on her. I mean, we'll keep that our little secret because I know some people probably think I do, but I'm grateful that children want to get involved and think about things. But my strong recommendation to people is always not to push politics onto your children, because they need to make up their own minds, and that's the purpose of voting. When it comes to the 1-star reviews, I mean, look, I've been on different interviews where we've scrolled through those 1-star interviews for a laugh. I find them quite entertaining, and most of them, I believe, are unverified purchases, which at the end of the day, it's just people who are angry, who are negative. And when I look back at 20, 30 years ago when I was a kid growing up, if we didn't like something we saw on TV, we just turned it off. And nowadays it's, well, if I don't like something, I'm going to be vocal about it. And that's okay, because people have that right. And I may not agree with some of those opinions, but I definitely defend them to the death for the right to say it.
Right. Now, we've talked about the How the Prime Minister Stole Freedom book. January 30th, you had a new book out. What can you tell us about this one?
Well, I approached Tamara Lich back in September. We were in the process of launching our second book, following up How the Prime Minister Stole Freedom, which we launched in November, called One Face, Two Face, Black Face, Blue Face. And I'd approached Tamara and said, look, I started this other project, and at the same time, I've been toiling with the fact of doing something for the anniversary of the Freedom Convoy, and something that's somewhat of a tribute to the Freedom Convoy. I know we touched on the convoy in How the Prime Minister Stole Freedom, but I wanted something that was just as inspirational for people that got off of the Prime Minister, so to speak, and more onto the purpose of the convoy. So with Tamara's blessing, as much as people say, well, the convoy was more than Tamara, I understand that. I agree with that. And I've spoken with the board, I've spoken with legal, I've spoken with everybody that's been attached to that movement that I can get in contact with. And I've told them all, look, by putting Tamara's name on the cover, this is by no means a slap at the hard work and the trials and tribulations that everyone has gone through during this event. But when you look at the media, when you look at the coverage, Tamara has been mostly focused as the focal point of the face of the convoy, so to speak. Now, part of my concern was also the treatment she's received in terms of being thrown into jail twice, the unfair treatment of not being allowed to be online, to have a voice, to be suppressed. So I really wanted to put a book together that kind of kept her relevant in the public eye and kind of told the government that she's not going away anytime soon. And to also pay tribute to the convoy, which I think we've done fairly in this book, and I really hope people enjoy it.
Yes. Well, I know I'm looking forward to reading them both. I was going to mention that "hold the line" was a very popular phrase that I heard when I was walking the streets of Ottawa. And I will say, as we've been on the subject of Tamara very briefly, I echo your statements, a wonderful person, of course. But that Thursday when they arrested her, it was definitely like that whole situation was a chessboard and they had taken the queen of the people off the board. You know, some people might think that's seditious, but that really seemed to me to be what it was. As people read your books, what do you hope they'll take away from them?
Honestly, at the end of the day, the purpose of my books are to inspire and to entertain. If people come away feeling like they got their money's worth and they had a good laugh, that they feel that burning of being a Canadian inside of them again, I feel I've done my job. My books are never written on a scale to try to influence or sway one person to the right or to the left. I've always said numerous times in multiple interviews, I'm very party neutral when it comes to voting. I try to keep an open mind, just like I do with my news sources, that I want to be educated on what's out there. I feel votes are important no matter where you live, despite people's feelings of electoral reform and representation, so to speak. So at the end of the day, if people come away feeling like they've been entertained and they feel better about themselves, that at the end of the day is the end goal.
Right. So we've circled back to the court jester. But before we go, because unfortunately we're out of time, can you tell our viewers how they can get your books?
Absolutely. So currently the only publisher that will hold our books is Amazon, and you can find them over on Amazon.ca, Amazon.com, or worldwide on any Amazon site. I believe they are available for purchase both digitally and physically. You can find all of our books there, from How the Prime Minister Stole Freedom to One Face, Two Face, Black Face, Blue Face, as well as our newest Tamara Lich, or Hold the Line, The Ballad of Tamara Lich.
Right. Derek, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure to sit down with you.
For all of us here at Bird City News, I'm Michael Clausen. Thanks for watching.